Hi, welcome to session 2 of the sixth topic of the semester, the Great Depression from 1929 to 1939. So this is session 2, and we're going to continue now discussing the causes, the origins of the Great Depression. There's still some material to cover regarding this portion, dealing with the background, the origins. And then after we finish covering the origins, we're now going to move into the actual coming in process of the Great Depression itself, the Great Crash of 1929, and then dealing with how two presidential administrations, one by President Herbert Hoover and the other one by FDR, from different political parties, by the way, that how they're going to manage, handle, respond to the Great Crash, to the economic crises of the Great Depression. So there will be sharp, differences in the way they approached the crises and what they implemented, what kind of policies they implemented, by the way, as well. Something that we're going to cover, of course, in this session, session 2. So let us now turn to our lecture outline to continue looking at the causes. Now, I indicated in at the end of session 1, this is, again, something that I was actually elaborating upon at the end of session 1, looking at the rise of consumer culture in the United States. We were looking at the rise of a consumer economy. Of course, this is something that we covered quite extensively in session 1. One of the leading causes for the Great Depression is that the American economy in the opening years of the 20th century became increasingly dependent upon the consumer of goods and services. This is a consumer economy. And so the growth, the health, the expansion of the economy dependent upon the rate, the frequency of consumption. Again, if people had jobs, for example, if they were, they maintained wages, if there was any credit, for example, and the like, that all depended upon the rate of consumption. We're looking at the rise of new industries, the industries of consumption. Those were brand new, again, industries that were now introducing new products that were in many cases necessary, to conduct, the activities of people living in the cities, but not just people living in the cities, by virtually every American, but they were vital in the city more so than anywhere else. For example, the automobile industry, introducing the Model T. This automobile was necessary to move in the city. Again, to move around, and from work to the home, to run errands, to do business trips, visit family members and the like. That led to more consumption. Again, the automobile itself was not just a consumer product, but that consumer product led to a lot of more consumption, like traveling, vacationing, partying, and the like. So you can do so many activities with the automobile that leads to more consumption. The rise of a tourist industry, for example, we were talking about that. People are taking road trips, families taking vacations once or twice a year, moving out of state into many destinations. They're going to say the rise of a tourist industry as well. Okay. So we were looking at that again, the growth again of new industries that are going to hire, of course, hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the production of those goods, that the consumption of those goods depended upon those people maintaining their jobs at the same time. If people are buying cars constantly and frequently, the workforce in the automobile industry is going to be maintained and possibly expanded as well, and the wages will be maintained. There's all interrelated, by the way, they're all interconnected. The consumption and the jobs, they're all interrelated. So we're looking at that industry. We're looking at the appliance, industry as well, domestic appliances, toasters, radios, washing machines, and the like, boilers, etc. irons and the like. Again, all of those were innovations, technological innovations of the early 20th century, greatly needed in the household, shortening the span, again, of work and the consumption of energy for people doing those tasks as well. And of course, there's going to be also fascination about that as well. Okay. People are consuming those products. And of course, those industries hire, once again, massive amounts of people in the production of those goods. That also, just like the automobile, the amount of jobs, again, that those industries had created were to be maintained only if the rate of consumption of those products were maintained as well. Okay. So we were discussing, of course, also the entertainment industry, the new venues, movies, sports, okay, dances and the like. That led to more consumption as well. Okay. So again, those are new industries that are on the rise, that are hiring millions of Americans, and this is going to be a very productive sector of the economy, by the way, because it's going to generate massive quantities of products, consumer products, that people were fascinated about and they were rushing to consume. They were so fascinated about them. Of course, everybody wanted to own an automobile, for example, etc. Every household must have one and the like. Everybody wanted to go party, entertain themselves, go dance, go to the movies and the like. Again, this was a great time. The economy booming, so to speak. So what this is going to lead to, I was explaining, is that this is going to lead to not only the American economy becoming now a consumer economy, but also that the culture of the country was changing. American culture was becoming more and more centered around the idea of consumption. It was becoming a consumer culture, that is to say. Okay, so this is extremely important. Okay, to note that when we study the 20th century, particularly, we see the rise of consumer cultures around the world, and the United States is becoming the leader, again, of those types of cultures. The United States is not going to be the only one, again, really shaping the culture in this fashion and becoming centered around the consumption of goods and services. This is a shared value in the population of the United States. This is what Americans all share in common as to be what is the meaning, what is the purpose of human existence. The purpose of human existence is to be happy, but how do we attain human happiness is through the consumption of goods and services. This is how we find enjoyment, entertainment. This is how we're happy, in other words, attain happiness, through the consumption of goods and services. So the United States is really moving in this direction quite rapidly, and is going to have a great influence, the United States, in shaping the cultures of other societies around the world in terms of moving those societies more and more towards a consumer culture as well. Okay, particularly with the rise of globalization, again, in the 20th century, as we're going to see again now the interaction of many different nations coming together for commercial exchange or trade, forming alliances, and of course, there's going to be communication systems as well, becoming highly advanced, like the radio, the television, then much later in the 20th century, digital systems, the computer, the internet, and the world is becoming more and more interconnected. We're going to see also the rise of a global consumer culture likewise as well. So this is not just something that will stay restricted within the United States, this consumer culture, but this consumer culture is going to move outwards, is going to move into places like Europe, is going to be moving into places like Latin America, places like Mexico, for example, South America. Gradually, those societies are going to be transformed and moving more and more towards this shared value that how do you attain happiness by consuming products, consumption of goods and services. So something that is entering in certain societies, even in the present day, like in Asia, is moving gradually towards this particular culture as well. Some areas of the Middle East, some areas of Africa are also gradually moving slowly but surely towards this consumer culture. So we're seeing the rise of a global consumer culture now in the 21st century, something that started out in the early years of the 20th century in the United States, by the way. So I wanted to connect again in this initial portion of the second session, what we have discussed at the end of the first session now with what we're discussing now in the second session. We were talking about consumer culture, and I indicated that I was going to overview again this segment. Particularly, I want to re-emphasize again this segment of consumer culture once again, because it's just so important to understand today's world. It's so important to understand ourselves right now in the 21st century. Again, how we think, how we value life, what are the most valuable things in life for us, what are the things that we pursue, that we think will bring happiness, to our lives, and so on and so forth. And more, even without thinking about it, we, in many cases, think that consumption is the way. This is how we're happy. And this is going to explain also, for example, how people feel when they're not consuming, okay? When there's economic downturns, when there's economic depressions, how people are going to feel about not consuming, that are they going to find any meaning in life? If happiness comes through consumption, but if you're not consuming because there's no jobs, because there's no money, how are you going to feel about it? Are you going to be happy or unhappy? So, of course, there's a reason why economic depressions are called depressions. They're called depressions because people feel depressed. It's a psychological state, depression. Why call it an economic depression when we can call it an economic crisis? Okay, there's so many ways we can call again an economic depression. In some other ways, some other forms that does not involve labeling again the crisis as a psychological state. And because when we mention the word depression, when somebody feels depressed, it's really saying that they're sad, that they're totally unmotivated, they're uninspired, they're experiencing grief, they're gloomy and the like again. So that is depression, and can be a clinical depression as well that can last for years. So there's a reason why economic crises are called depressions, is because when those crises occur in populations that consider consumption as the means to human happiness, therefore, an economic crisis that hinders the production of goods, the sale of goods, in other words, consumption, is going to bring unhappiness. In other words, people are going to feel depressed. They're not consuming, so therefore they're depressed. They're not prospering, therefore, if you're not prospering, therefore there's something wrong in your life. In other words, so people feel psychologically down. In other words, emotionally depressed as well. The loss of status. Okay, people lose status. You used to be middle class, now you're down, in the ladder. That demotion, if you will, is also a source of grief for a lot of people, particularly when we value economic success as the goal of life, that this is, the goal of life, to be so successful, to be so prosperous, to accumulate wealth, for example, to have assets. That is what makes a human being successful and happy, in other words. So when you don't have that, therefore, there's a sense of depression. So again, I wanted to really psychoanalyze, what depressions are in the context of, what we're actually discussing here, that is consumerism, is consumer culture that is on the rise, in which more and more people value once again, the consumption of goods and services as the means to attain happiness and joy. Okay, so that's exactly what I was actually referring at. Again, I wanted to pretty much use additional examples here to bring to light, again, the drives of consumerism. What drives human beings to consume? And as I explained, I mean, this is something that I've been stressing over and over again. And in consumer cultures, what drives individuals, the members of the culture, to consume is, once again, is that there's a conviction in the members of the society that share this value of consumption, that the consumption of certain products bring happiness. In other words, that this is how you be happy. In other words, you're gonna get happy with purchasing certain products. So as a matter of fact, most of the marketing and advertisement is geared to sell you happiness more so than the product itself. If you really pay attention, again, to a commercial, when you see a commercial on TV, when you see an ad on a magazine, on a billboard, etc., what they're actually selling you is not really the product itself, but they're selling you happiness. In other words, if you buy this product, you're going to be happy. Okay, let's say makeup. Okay, something so simple. Okay, if you see a commercial on TV that they're selling you makeup for women, particularly, but again, this is a product that you see in a commercial, women wearing the makeup, etc. They're not really talking about necessarily all of the ingredients. They might suggest that it's organic, or this is not going to damage your skin, it's going to nourish it because it has special oils. Yes, it's true. But that's not the essence of the commercial. The essence is, look, in this commercial, you're seeing a woman that initially, in the beginning of the commercial, is not very happy. She doesn't feel attractive. She's not getting the attention of other people, etc., at the office, or you name it. But after buying the product and wearing the product, suddenly, by magic, she walks into the office and nobody knows who she is because she's just so beautiful. And everybody's turning to see her, and they're like, "What did you do? You look younger, and whatever it is, you look really beautiful." And everybody is now giving her attention. That is to say, in other words, at the end of the commercial, she's happy. By the use of this product, she attained happiness. She was lacking it because she felt unattractive, etc., not very beautiful, etc. But now she feels very attractive because she used the product. In other words, so that is the essence of advertisement. They're selling you happiness. What they're actually selling you is not the product itself, but rather what the product brings to you. Whether it's a car, okay, they're selling you a car in the commercial. There's at the end a happy family. They're joyful that they obtain, this automobile, this car, this SUV, etc. And everybody's happy. Everybody is having a good time in the car. There's the dog there. They're watching films, etc. It's just a great time. In other words, they're all happy. So you go case by case, and you'll see that in advertisement, what they're actually selling you, psychologically speaking, okay, is a state. If you buy this, you acquire a state of being in which you are going to find fulfillment, enjoyment, happiness, in other words, if you only purchase it, by the way. So go case by case. You can do that on your own. You can watch TV and just pay attention to it. Again, and you'll see that they're trying to sell you happiness, particularly when people feel, unhappy, they're grieving, they're in grief, they're might be in a low, mood, etc., or they lack enthusiasm, etc. And so people with low self-esteem usually are the ones that are going to now be driven, again, to consume products, particularly because they perceive that the product is going to actually improve their self-esteem, make them feel better, either more attractive, more beautiful or happier, etc., whatever, the situation is. that they lack, in other words. So this is the essence of advertisement. First and foremost, what they're selling you is just happiness in the product itself. Okay. So that's number one. And the other, of course, drive towards consumption I was mentioning is that people also are driven to consume goods and services because they see that by consuming certain brands, by consuming certain products, they're going to communicate success. In other words, they're going to reveal, they're going to express to the members of the society who they are in society, particularly when it comes to class or what kind of position you occupy in society, whether you're a high member or a high ranking member, for example, of a corporation or industry, a business, for example, or in the political administration and the like, that consumption is a way to communicate success, okay, especially when you consume certain brands, certain products. So let me give you an example here. Let's say you're humble in your teens, and you're hoping to go to college because you want to do something with your life. You have aspirations. You come from a humble background, so to speak. So you go to college, you go to university, and you're trying to save money. You buy, maybe food at the gas station to save money. You're driving an old truck, a Chevy truck, whatever. Doesn't matter the brand. You live in a small apartment, etc. You're humble. So you go through your studies. Then at the end of your academic studies, you happen to graduate and be very successful. You end up in a high-paying job. Let's just say that you have this very, very good luck, if you will, that you end up in this enterprise, this corporation, and you're earning a lot of money now. So this movement, this upward mobility from being humble to now have this type of success, this new, new status, if you will, that you're earning a lot of money, now, a lot. Okay. You want to express that. Okay. So most people, I'm not saying 100%, but most people are driven to express that upward mobility. And the way to do it is by consumption. You want to now maybe buy you the latest model, again, of an automobile that you always wanted. But the brand has to be pricey. It has to be classy. Okay. Not just the latest new truck, but rather a very fancy car, because that is going to express who you are, your class. You're now a member of a new class, the upper class, maybe some fancy car of whatever, foreign brand, etc., etc. You want to drive around that. You're not going to be buying food from a gas station anymore. You're going to go to expensive restaurants and the like, again, to be exhibited there, to be seen there by others doing that, because that is going to reveal who you are in society. You're spending money, in other words, in a very pricey, very expensive restaurant and the like. You're going to move to a part of town that is also going to be the best part of town, buy a good house, etc., because that is going to be an expression of who you are as a member of an upper class. So this consumption, again, this consumerism, if you will, it's also a way to express class, to express rank and your social status. And the more conspicuously you do it, the more, in other words, noticeable, that if you're spending in a very noticeable way, that people see you spending money, in other words. They see you spending on very expensive products, expensive clothing with very pricey brands, that's much better, because the more conspicuous the consumption is, the more noticeable, the consumption is, the more you're going to communicate your success. That is to say, this is something that the sociologist Veblen was writing about. He actually wrote a theory about consumer culture called the theory of the leisure class and conspicuous consumption. And he pretty much said this again. He witnessed again early in the 20th century the rise of consumer culture. And he actually wrote a theory saying one of the reasons why Americans consume so conspicuously is because they're so adamant to communicate who they are as a class, in other words, because everybody believes in success. The minute you attain that success, you want to communicate that with, with consumption, with the expensive brands. You want to show the logos of those expensive brands and the like, etc. Again, you can see that even in the entertainment industry, popular culture and artists and musicians, rock stars and the like, that are all exhibiting limousines, for example, jewelry, or they're exhibiting, champagne, and they're partying, in very expensive outlets, etc. Like rock stars, for example. You see that very commonly, because what they're actually expressing is that they're famous and that they're very successful. So therefore, they can afford to purchase everything that you're seeing on those videos, or in the magazines about their lives, because what they're really trying to communicate to you is that they're able to consume everything they have because they are, of course, wealthy. Okay, they're expressing to you that they're part of the upper class. In other words, that's again another drive that many people feel very compelled about. That people feel compelled to actually exhibit, of course, their social class through the purchasing, the consumption of goods and services. That's another drive. Again, some people are driven to that. Some people are looking for happiness, but other people consume because they're trying to communicate success. Now, the third, I was mentioning at the end of session 1, the third drive of consumerism is that some people consume products because they see in them empowerment. Okay, they feel that there's a magnetic attraction that certain products have, that if they possess them, if they wear them, that magnetic force that they see, that is like magic. In other words, there's a certain magic to certain products, that they're going to be tapping into that magical force. So therefore, they're going to acquire the magical qualities, the powers of the object, in other words, and is going to change their personality, is going to empower them, make them better, more skillful, and the like. This is called commodity fetishism. People develop a fetish, again, on certain products, believing that by owning them, they're going to tap into the power of the object. One example is, for example, people that develop a fetish on, let's say, guitars that were, let's say, played by famous musicians. Okay, so collectibles. Okay, so I want to buy a guitar that was once played by Jimi Hendrix, Stevie Ray Vaughan, just naming, some of those musicians that were legendary, that had a certain magic, again, in their playing, if you will. Why will people pay thousands and thousands of dollars for an instrument that was once played by any of those musicians? Is because in their magical mind, we do operate, also with a magical mind. This is the magical mind that we operated under when we're a child, when we're children, before the age of reason, that is to say. So besides the rational mind, there's a magical mind, and that is within us. And this magical mind believes that certain objects have powers. Okay, think of children, believing that, that if they wore the Superman outfit, they could fly, for example. Okay, because the outfit is totally, magical, for example. So it's very common in children. So likewise, when we're adults, we kind of retain aspects of that magical mind and continue to see certain objects as endowed with magic, a magnetic force, like guitars. Well, if this guitar was played by Jimi Hendrix or Stevie Ray Vaughan, for example, their magic, okay, their skills, their magic was imprinted on that instrument. So that instrument has the magic, again, of that particular guitarist. So if I own it, that means I'm going to be tapping into the magic of that musician. And by owning the instrument and playing it, the magical mind believes, this is not something they're even thinking about, but they believe inwardly that playing that instrument is going to enable them to play better, maybe just like that. This is something that we don't recognize, we don't even think about, we don't even believe in that, but our magical mind does, particularly when we develop a fetish about particular objects, like shoes, for example. People wear shoes and buy a lot of shoes because every shoe is seen as magical. If I wear these shoes, I feel like I'm this persona. But if I wear these other ones, I totally change my personality. I become something more intelligent, more attractive, more mysterious, more secure, etc. Doesn't matter. Think of the sneakers, the tennis shoes, Jordan. That in the advertisement, again, it shows that if you wear these shoes, you'll be able to jump as high as Michael Jordan. Okay, Michael Jordan was called Magic Jordan, because he was just jumping so high, throwing the basketball and scoring, etc. So there were tennis shoes that were marketed as the Jordan tennis shoes again. And so a lot of children will say, I want to buy those because by wearing, again, those shoes, I'll be able to jump as high as Michael Jordan. The magical mind thinks that, by the way. And so this is also another drive that why people feel compelled to purchase, to consume, is because they want empowerment. They want to jump high. They want to look at, more secure, or they want to increase their skills in an instrument. And they're buying, again, things that they believe have that magic that is going to empower them to be something or to do something that they think they cannot do. Okay, so that's another, again, reason why, again, there's going to be a consumer culture. And again, this consumer culture is going global. Again, we're going to see that consumer culture is, of course, rising in the United States in the early decades of the 20th century, but across the 20th century and all the way to today, this consumer culture is going to become a global phenomenon. More and more societies around the world will be exposed to those systems of thought. Again, consumption brings happiness, is a way to express success, and brings empowerment. And more societies around the world are moving in this direction. So we're seeing also the rise of a global consumer culture at the same time. Now, let's move forward then with moving into the Great Depression itself. So again, consumerism is so important to understand the Great Depression in almost every level, economically, psychologically, culturally, you name it. Again, consumerism, the consumer economy, consumer industries, how many jobs were created, how many people depended upon incomes that they earn in those industries, the automobile industries, appliances, entertainment, and the like. Again, and how the values of the population are changing and becoming more centered on consumption. So with a consumer economy, also came consumer credit. Okay. And as a matter of fact, the introduction of consumer credit was also integral to enabling a consumer economy to arise in the first place as well. So in other words, this consumption, this high-level consumption that was taking place in the country in the 1910s and 1920s was largely due to the introduction of credit, okay, as well. So without credit, it would have been difficult to maintain this high-level consumption rate, of the, let's say, the roaring 20s. This is when the economy was booming to unprecedented levels due to the rate and frequency of consumption, again, in the United States. The credit was part of the equation, in other words. Now, credit itself already existed in the United States, but it was actually a system that provided loans to producers, more commercial credit, in other words. So yes, so indeed, there was credit. It existed in the 19th century, but those were actually loans issued, let's say, to manufacturers, issued to farmers that wanted to acquire technologies, etc., ranchers that wanted to buy land. Those were it was commercial banking, in other words. So yeah, there was credit, but there was always, for investment. You wanted to invest it in some form of enterprise, that is to say. But now, as we move into the early decades of the 1900s, we're going to see now a new type of credit that is called consumer credit. This is not necessarily for investment, not necessarily, because there's going to be some, of course, geared towards investment, but it was more for consumption. If you wanted to buy a certain product but did not have all the money to buy it, well, there's going to be new institutions, financial institutions that are going to offer, of course, the opportunities for you to earn, to be given a loan, to be given some money on credit, so you can purchase whatever you needed, whether it was a house or it was an automobile, or let's say a refrigerator, a washing machine, and the like, and even again to take a vacation as well. Okay, why not? So again, we're going to see the rise of a credit economy, credit expansion, in which now individuals, not industries, not producers necessarily, are going to be the ones obtaining, again, loans and credit, once again, to buy now and pay later, in other words. And so the vast majority of the credit that was issued for the consumption of goods and services were issued by the industries themselves, the retail stores. In other words, there's a retail store that sells appliances, and they offer store credit, retail credit. You apply, you have a job, okay? They'll issue the credit. You can take, that washing machine or vacuum, etc., clothing, perfumes, and the like, and you pay later because you have a job. So as long as you have a job, you can prove that you're employed, you're being given credit, you're being paid installments, to that retail store. It was very commonly, again, in the particularly in the 1910s, but particularly most intensely in the 1920s. If we just look at the astronomical increase in the number of loans that were issued and the amount of debt, consumer debt, that Americans acquired, let's say in 10 years between 1919 and 1929, you see that there was a dramatic astronomical increase, in only a 10-year period, starting with 100 million, borrowed in 1919, of credit buying. People were buying on credit, and they borrowed 100 million in the United States. And 10 years later, this figure had rose to 7 billion. There was already a large consumer debt, in the United States by 1929. This is the moment of the great crash we're going to look at, of course, in just a few moments. So this reveals that this booming economy that we were referring at, again, in previous moments, the roaring 20s, when the economy was booming, there was a consumption spree in the country. There were millions of people rushing in the main streets of the country, going to retail stores and buying a lot of products, etc., going to shopping malls and the like. That a great portion, again, of this consumption was carried out with credit buying, people using credit, again, in order to actually purchase those goods. And again, as I mentioned, even taking a vacation itself, many people borrow. Again, I'm just borrow some money, take the family out, etc., and pay it later. And the reason why people felt confident that this was a viable system was because the economy was booming. So when we are in a booming cycle, people feel very confident that this cycle is going to last a good while. In other words, look, there's going to be jobs, there are, there will be incomes in the future. You're kind of speculating that, again, things are going to remain somewhat the same. And so you have a source of income that will be steady. So therefore, you're going to be making payments and pretty much clearing your debt. So people feel confident, to take that credit, in other words. This is, again, part of this consumer economy. This is the first reason that we have analyzed in great depth. In that we looked at the rise of a consumer economy with a new industries like the automobile, appliances, entertainment, and the like, with a consumer culture that is, of course, on the rise as well, high-level consumption, and also the rise of consumer credit was part of this consumer economy. Of course, they're all in the same package, if you will, and the first cause leading to the Great Depression, because as we'll see, as long as the rate of consumption continued to be steady, then everybody was keeping their jobs and their wages and the like. The economy can continue moving along. But if for any reason the rate of consumption comes to a halt, then the entire economy will come to a halt as well. Those industries that hire millions of people will have to downsize, of course, and something we're going to see. And again, this is going to activate, again, a series of events leading to the great crash, of course, of 1929. Exactly, that is the second reason, the second factor leading up to the Great Depression was the stock market crash of 1929. The stock market fell, in other words, in 1929. And with that, we're going to see, of course, the coming of the Great Depression. So let us analyze this more in depth. I mean, can be quite complex and intricate, again, sector of history, but I will really do my best to explain it as simple as possible, using simple terms, simple analysis, again, to make it really understandable, in other words. So the stock market really is a system by which the public participates in the finances, in the operations, in the distribution, in the selling of products that a certain company is doing by simply investing in the company. You invest in the company, and by investing in that company, the company actually gives you a share of its net worth. In other words, you buy a share, a portion of the company if you invest in it. Okay. And by investing in it, again, in that company, the company is going to use that investment for the production of those goods, for the distribution, for all the operations, in other words, that are required. And so if the company is going to do well, if they're going to sell products, you're going to get also a share, again, of the profits. The greater the amount of investment, the more shares you own, the greater the share of the profits. That's how it works in very simple terms. This is something that started out in Europe. The stock market itself, has been operating, since the 1700s in Europe, in places like London, for example. London, the enterprises, the companies actually open up their companies for public investment. Okay, for the public to own shares. In other words, they sold stock, again, by allowing people to buy the shares, invest in the company, and people were holding now, again, shares of the net worth of the company, with the expectation that if the company was doing well, their shares was going to increase in worth, and they could either, receive the monies that they were owed, because if the company is increasing the profits, they will have to share the profits with the shareholders. Or there was also the opportunity to sell your share that was more valuable in the future because this company was, doing so great, and sell it at a higher price to another individual. So there's money to be made, in other words, by buying shares. This is the stock market. And of course, you have to invest in the most successful companies, the most successful industries, the most successful enterprises that you feel are going to do great. They're going to do, much, much better in the future. Okay. So you have to study the market, study the industries, and buy from the most successful ones. In other words, that are growing, that are going to have a future. You want to invest in those, of course. So the stock market that existed was headquartered in London ever since the 1700s. Is going to move from London to New York after World War One. At the end of World War One, Great Britain was heavily indebted to the United States. The United States, as I mentioned in the previous topic, provided assistance, financial assistance to the British to help them, fight the Germans. So at the end, the British were totally indebted to the Americans. And so one way to compensate, not to clear the debt, but to compensate for this large debt, because now the United States is emerging from World War One as a creditor nation. Again, they're the ones that are going to issue credit because, again, this is a very wealthy country that was not that affected, as a matter of fact, by the European countries that fought in Europe during the First World War. So because now the United States is emerging as a creditor nation, again, now the stock market is going to move to New York, of course. This is the beginning of called Wall Street, of course, in New York. So now Americans, okay, are going to have, after 1919, a new opportunity to rise in the economic ladder, okay? That there's the traditional path of success is working very hard, going to school, earning a degree, working in a company, and working yourself up, within the company to, attain a better status, higher salary, and the like. That takes a lot of years, dedication, work, study, etc. Okay, and that's the traditional path for success. But the other path of success is, you buy stock in the stock market. Again, you buy shares, you invest in companies, because now they are here. They're in America. In the past, they were in Europe. So the Americans who invested in the stock market in London, there's just a handful of Americans, okay? Because, again, you have to be totally informed about European economic systems, European politics, read the newspaper, and it was just so far away, London, that is to say, to be so much involved in the stock market in London, but now it's here, it's in New York, it's close to you. So now you can just read the newspaper, okay, American newspapers, and look at the companies, the industries that are offering shares. Again, they are welcoming public investment. You can buy a share from an American company. It's easier. You can just pick and choose. And this is the fast track to riches. That instead of spending so many years studying and working hard to move upward in the ladder, all you need to do is just take a training course, a couple of semesters, etc. Just understand how the market works, and and invest in the stock market. Because if you invest in the stock market, if you're very, very clever, if you really have a good understanding of how the market works, you can actually buy shares from a very successful company or industry that is going to increase your investment many times fold. So if you buy a share, let's say $1 a share, this is just, again, a hypothetical, number, or just for simplicity's sake. If you buy a share at $1 each share from a company that is doing so well, because it's expanding, it's becoming very popular, the product, etc., that share can increase, let's say, 5 or 10 times its worth in only 2 or 3 years. So if you buy, let's say, 100 shares at $100, multiply that times 5, 10 times 10, and this is how much your shares are going to be worth in only 2 or 3 years. You can either keep those shares or you can sell them, and you get a very good return on that initial investment of $100. You're going to get thousands of dollars in return. Again, so that is, what Americans are going to start doing now. They're going to start buying stock again in order to bet again on the success of industries that they perceived they were going to do very well, like the automobile industry, the appliances industry, clothing, shoes, etc. They're going to pick and choose. They're going to say, I think this industry is doing so well. I want to participate again in the success of that industry. I speculate, in other words, I predict that if I buy, let's say 10 shares, now that their worth is going to increase 500% in 3 years. I can see the chart. I can see the trend of the rate of sales and consumption, again, that people are engaged in. They're buying so many shoes. They're buying so many cars. And I see that this trend is going to increase. So I'm going to buy shares from this automobile industry because I predict that if I buy the shares now, down the line, I'll be richer. My investment is going to multiply 5-10 times again. So it requires speculation. Speculation is prediction. You predict that this is going to happen. You're going to make an investment based on predictions. It's what's called speculation. You're speculating, you're predicting that this is going to be so because this is the trend. This is what the chart is showing, the rate of consumption, etc. Okay, so this is a very successful enterprise. I want to actually invest in it, of course. So how were people buying stock, therefore, in the stock market? How were people actually buying the stock? Well, if you have the money, okay, at hand, you can just go and buy it and pay cash. But now that there's a credit system, okay, there's a credit economy, you can make a very wise use of it. In other words, look, you can buy stock on credit, okay? Why not? There's financial institutions, there are banks, for example, that are willing to loan money to investors, people that want to buy shares, they want to buy stock in American industries, American enterprises that are members of Wall Street, for example. And there's the opportunity of doing that. And why not? In other words, I'm going to borrow money, buy shares, because I predict that my shares are going to increase in worth and I will be able to pay back the loan. So once again, they're going to go to the bank. They're going to actually request, again, a loan. In many cases, the loan officer will have to request some form of collateral or security on the loan, and people are going to actually, put their houses, their homes, or certain properties, again, that they own as collateral for the initial loan. Again, so the bank is going to issue a loan, but it needs some security. So initially they request something, a piece of property, etc. Okay, so here it is. Here's a loan. So you go and then you go buy stock on the stock market, okay, with that credit. Now, as time progressed in the 1920s, Americans, what they're doing is that they're returning to the bank to request more loans, indicating that they have purchased very valuable stock from certain enterprises and say, look, the money you loan me, I'm holding shares from such and such company, and now this is increased in value. Can I acquire more loans because I really want to invest even more in the stock market, but I don't have the money at hand. I need a large loan. And so in many cases, what the loan officers, the banks were doing is saying, okay, so give me that stock that you bought that is valuable, and I'm going to actually use it as collateral, as security to issue more loans to you so you can buy more stock. So instead of holding on to real assets like land and houses, etc., the banks began to issue loans to investors that did not have any real assets other than stock they were holding that was at that point in time very valuable. But the bank is going to say, I'm going to actually hold it and put it here in the bank as security. So if you fail to pay this loan, the bank is simply going to use your stock again as a security. We're going to sell it and compensate for this loan that you defaulted. So everything made sense because the economy was booming, the stock market was booming, and consumption again was at a very high rate. So there's nothing to worry about. They thought, okay, the banks are making secure loans because they are totally protected. They're holding on to stock that is totally valuable. It's this very, secure. The stock market is very sound. And so the banks in the United States were issuing so many loans that by 1929, 4 million people own stock. The vast majority of them actually own stock on credit. They need to pay back the loans they obtained to buy that stock because it was all bought on credit. And the expectation is the economy will continue to move in this direction. And we're going to pay back the loans because we're getting rich. The value of the stock was increasing every year. And instead of selling the stock in order to actually get the money to pay back the loan, people were simply saying, no, just hold on. If we can just hold, wait for another 2 or 3 years, our stock is going to be so much valuable that by that time, then we're going to sell it. In other words, instead of trying to get rid of their stock rather quickly and get the money, get their investment back, their returns back, they were still holding on again to their stock, thinking that it will become more and more valuable if they just simply waited a little bit more. Okay, so those expectations that the economy was simply going to grow in the future, then instead of trying to get rid again of the stock when it actually had increased in value in order to get something in return and pay back their loans, by 1929, okay, in that year, particularly in that year, the economy began to experience a series of downturns, okay, that reveal how fragile the stock market actually was. Okay, so this is going to initiate a cascade of crises leading to finally the great crash of 1929 towards the end of 1929. Okay, and the first sign that the economy was to move in this towards this downturn was the fact that it came to a gradual halt. It was slowing down significantly in the early months of 1929. Again, it was slowing down because one of the causes for that, again, and many historians believe that this is a very, very sound reason, is because of overproduction. Okay. The idea back in this time was just engage in the mass production of goods, whether you're a shoe manufacturer, clothing manufacturer, whether you're producing grain, if you're a farmer, if you're a cattle rancher, you want to just mass produce, again, cattle. If you're engaged in the steel industry, likewise, if you're in the automobile industry, just mass produce, everything is mass production, of course, a mass production of appliances and the like. Okay, everybody was, in that mode of production, in that mode of thought. Okay, that if you just simply engage in more and more production, the economy will simply continue to grow because there's always a market, there's always people buying it, of course. But overproduction eventually had the contrary effect. It actually led to underconsumption because there's only so much food people can actually eat, by the way. There's only so much beef, can be consumed. But when it comes to the industries, the consumer industries, like the automobile industries and the appliance industries, uh, it came a time eventually when there was no need to purchase more automobiles because everybody got a hold of one. Okay. So once you acquire an automobile, there's no reason to acquire another one anytime soon. Once everybody got a hold of appliances, when everybody had a refrigerator and vacuums, etc., because they were made of highly durable materials. Again, they were made of steel. Again, they were tough built, heavy duty. They were resistant. And again, they're hard to break as well. So once you acquired those appliances, there was no need to acquire another one for the next 10 years or more. So the rate of consumption eventually is going to come down. It's going to slow down. Okay. The frequency, the rate of consumption is going to start slowing down. And of course, that set off, a series of policies within many of the industries, many of the manufacturing industries, the industries of consumerism, the industries of consumption, will have to then downsize the workforce and the operations. So downsizing or downsizes, well, if our shoes or cars or appliances aren't being sold the way they were again in previous years, there's no need to maintain such a large workforce. Okay, we need to reduce the number of workers. We need to start cutting expenses, certain departments that are not really necessary, to start reducing the number of personnel, etc. So you downsize, if you will, the structure. Again, the level of operations again are going to actually decrease and be more compact. Okay, more compacted, of course, and you have to let people go. In other words, rising unemployment. So we're going to see now more and more people being laid off. They're unemployed because the industries cannot pay the wages, cannot keep up with all of the financial dues. Paying for departments, paying for the distribution of goods, because they're not receiving any profits. And they are, but again, it's being reduced in a significant way. So they have to downsize, and that led to, of course, growing unemployment. And with that, again, inevitably, this is going to lead to credit contraction. Okay, credit contraction. Why? Well, because many of the people that were laid off actually were defaulting on the loans. There were workers that had purchased certain products on credit and the like, and they were still making payments. But because they're out of work, they're unable to make any payments. They have dues, of course. They have the retail stores are, they're, collecting loans. They're collecting the debt on the loans, but workers have no wages. They're unemployed. They cannot pay back their loans, of course. So the credit system is contracting now. Credit institutions realize that you cannot issue credit to people when people don't have jobs. In other words, how can you offer credit, when people are not receiving incomes? In other words, so you have to contract it. In other words, we're going to see a contraction of the credit economy, and of course that set off, of course, a panic. Okay, on October 4th of 1929, in which the population realized that if this trend will continue this way, the rising unemployment, the credit contraction, the slowing down of the economy, that you need to run to the bank and withdraw all your savings all at once before that bank will close. In other words, because they realized that one of the institutions that will be greatly affected were the banks themselves. The banks issued a lot of loans again, during the 1920s, to investors buying stock, to individuals buying, home, houses, a lot of people were paying mortgages, of course, on their homes, etc. And they realized that one of the institutions that will crash eventually was the bank itself. So before the bank went bankrupt, they said, what we need to do is get our money, as quickly as possible. As quickly as possible, withdraw all your money. So they're run on the banks. And of course, many of the banks were decapitalized because even the savings had to be withdrawn. And in many cases, the banks had to close their doors to make it harder or for people to withdraw their money, because the banks were totally now decapitalized. All the capital is flowing out of the financial institutions, and the financial institutions, the banks, are simply left with a lot of debt, in other words. Okay. And this, of course, led to the end of credit itself. It was just impossible to obtain any credit, again, by October 1929. There's no way a bank can actually issue credit anymore because of the conditions, again, of the financial sector. And that, of course, inevitably led to the great crash, again, of October 29, 1929, of course, the great crash. And of course, the issue is that the banks, of course, are now left with a lot of debt, okay? A lot of debt. That in many cases, a great portion of this debt was debt that was created by millions of loans that they generated for people to buy stock on the stock market, to buy shares. And what happens is that as the industries realize that there's no more consumption because they're laying people off, there's growing unemployment, they're not making any sales, as I mentioned, they're downsizing, but at the same time, their stock, the worth, the value of the stock that they sold to investors is decreasing also dramatically, because the value of the stock is directly related to the profits that the company makes from the sales of the products that they create, okay, the products that they manufacture. So if they're not selling any products, therefore the worth of that share decreases. It has the contrary effect of decreasing in value, of course. So if the stock, okay, loses its value, what happens to all of the banks that were holding a lot of stock as security and collateral? It's not going to be worth anything. So a lot of banks were just holding two pieces of paper, a lot of stock that they collected from investors, holding them as security for a lot of the loans they issue. So they turn around and see that that stock is not worth anymore because the companies are either downsizing, or in many cases, they're closing down their operations. Many of them actually declare bankruptcy. So that stock, again, was totally evaporated. It was just paper itself, in other words. And a lot of the stock is held in banks, in other words. So this is leading to the great crash, again, on Tuesday, October 29, when it was realized that a great many companies had failed, closed their operations, and the stock that they had sold to millions of people, 4 million Americans, again, was totally, devalued. It had no value whatsoever. So investors that were holding that stock, or the banks that were holding onto that stock, believing that this was actually a real asset that they were holding as security for the loans they issued, it was totally worthless. So eventually, again, the stock market failed. It crashed completely. It was totally devalued. All the stock, again, that was sold was totally devalued. And of course, the institution that was mostly affected was, of course, the financial institution, the banks. In 1929, 2,300 banks failed. They also declared bankruptcy. They closed their doors. They totally failed at that point. And by 1933, that increased to 9,000 banks. So the financial sector was in shambles in the Great Depression. Savings, of course, were lost because a lot of people were unable to withdraw their savings from the financial institutions. $2.5 billion worth in savings were lost because as banks closed, people were unable to recover their savings, by the way. So those savings were also lost. The stock, of course, lost value dramatically. $14 billion of stock value pretty much was lost. In other words, all of the stock that was actually purchased by Americans. I mentioned there were 4 million Americans that own stock. That amounted to about $14 billion. Many people felt that they were actually rich because they were holding to very valuable stock, and so on and so forth. Well, again, with the stock market crash, all this stock lost its value, $14 billion again. Income fell 40%. That is to say, there were, of course, a lot of people that were employed, earning wages and incomes, but we're going to see about 40% unemployment. So therefore, incomes are also going to be lost, 40%, 40% unemployment. At the very height of the Great Depression, we're going to reach anywhere between 30 and 40%, again, according to some figures. That amounted to about 12,600,000 people unemployed, which was totally unprecedented. Looking at U.S. history, for example, when you look at U.S. history, again, there's been, of course, downturns, economic downturns from time to time in U.S. history, starting about the 1830s, about 1836, 1837. There was one economic downturn, another one in 1858, 1859, another one in 1873, another one in the 1890s as well, 1896, 1897. And there was, of course, unemployment, but never to this level. Again, never to this level that we're seeing now in the 1930s. In all the economic depressions of the past, unemployment reached about 12%. And that was considered alarming in the country. But now, forget about 12%. We're now reaching into the 30 all the way to the 40%. Again, unemployment, massive, of course. A lot of people were unable to pay their mortgages. Remember, a lot of people borrowed to buy, homes, etc., to buy houses. They were paying mortgages because there's unemployment. They're unable to do so. So we're going to see, of course, eviction. People being evicted from their homes. About 1 million, of course, people were actually evicted from their homes during the Great Crash. Again, the initial stages of the Great Depression as well. Okay, there's just a few minutes as well. All right, so far we have covered two great causes for the Great Depression. The growing dependency on a consumer economy. The national economy was based on consumption. So as we've seen, as consumption comes to a halt, that affected, of course, millions of jobs in the country, because a lot of the people that were hired in the country were hired in industries that were producing the products of consumption. So as consumption comes to a halt, we're going to see massive unemployment. Okay, so that's, and the other reason is the stock market crash itself. This is the other reason that led to the Great Depression, is that we see the rise of a stock market in which a number of industries in the United States sold stock or shares to private investors. There were about 4 million Americans that bought stock in one of the most prosperous, the most successful industries, most of which were involved in the production of consumer products. But as the rate of consumption slowed down, many of those industries have to downsize, in many cases close their operations, thereby affecting the value of the stock that they had sold to millions of Americans. And that, of course, not only devalued the stock, of course, the value of the stock market, the stock itself, but also the financial institutions that issued loans to those Americans that were purchasing the stock and that in many cases were holding the stock that people were buying as security to secure the loans that they had issued. So inevitably, again, when the stock market fell in value in 1929, that affected the financial institutions. We see massive amounts of banks, thousands of banks failing, massive unemployment, and of course, people being evicted, of course, from homes as well, unable to pay their mortgages. Now, the third reason, the third factor that led to the Great Depression. Now, this is a factor that is outside of the realm of human beings. This is something that has to do with nature. Nature also participates in shaping history, and it's not just a passive participant. I just want to stress that nature is actually a very active participant that it has really the upper hand, in shaping human societies. If societies are going to survive or not survive, or if people have to migrate from one area to another, if people have to change their institutions, their way of life, in many cases they do so out of the pressures of the environment. When the environment changes, when nature presents challenges, calamities, for example, droughts, that affects human beings. And we have to reorganize ourselves to survive. In many cases, we have to move from one area to the other because there's not enough food, there's not enough water, for example. There's human migrations occur precisely, in world history because the environment pressures people to do so. And the Great Depression is no exception. The Great Depression actually occurred as well because during the 1930s, particularly when we look from 1932 to 1940, in particularly those years, those 8 years, what we see is that in that decade, again, worldwide, we're going to see, again, natural calamities that made the Depression very, very real. That even if humans were to rapidly and quickly try to solve the problem and reorganize the economy, etc., there's the problem of nature, because during that decade, there were extended droughts all over the planet. Not only in the United States, all over the planet. Droughts in Latin America, North America, Africa, Europe, Asia, worldwide. Again, perhaps this is tied to the cycles of time. Nature goes through cycles. There are cycles of rain, cycles of drought. So maybe again that is tied to that. Again, there's something that we need to pretty much delve into more deeply to understand. The cycles of time, the cycles of nature. So again, extended droughts made the production of crops more difficult, particularly to farmers and peasants around the world that rely on the blessings of nature, rain, for the production of crops. So if you have no access to electricity, to modern machinery like irrigation systems, you're going to have a tough time producing food. Again, not that it was totally impossible, but it was harder. So the farmers in the United States that had that technology, the farmers that had access to electricity, to machinery, to water pumps, etc., irrigation systems, etc., they're going to have some success, again, in producing food. But farmers in the United States that did not have access to that technology, or farmers outside around the world, are going to have a tough time. Again, so there's a food shortage. Again, the food supply is going to come down as well. And of course, this dryness, the extensive droughts, again, is going to be felt in the erosion of the soil, again, in the Great Plains. Again, the farmers of the Great Plains are going to experience so much dryness. The lack of rain is going to dry the soil to an extent that it turns into powder. Again, and that, again, when the wind came along, it actually moved the soil, the powder, if you will, the particles of dust into the atmosphere to such a great extent that this led to the so-called the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl, the soil erosion. Those were sandstorms, so to speak, They were not really, it's not sand, it's actually dry soil again, but they look like sandstorms, by the way, that were moving across the Great Plains, across Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, even place of Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, and they started there, and they were moved all across the East. So even in places like Chicago, places like Boston, New York, in the eastern side of the country, they're going to witness the arrival of those large dust balls, as they were called. There was all the soil that had eroded in the Great Plains from the intensive agriculture. Again, they depleted the minerals through the intensive agriculture, the farmers, but also because of the droughts, the dryness, of course, of the soil itself. And of course, the so-called black blizzards, as they were known, reached the East Coast. Again, this is pretty much an actual photograph of how people actually witness, again, those phenomena. Again, this is something that deals with nature, is a natural event that is making the depression very, very real, in terms that, well, there is a shortage of food. Okay, it's not just that the stock market crash, etc. Food production, again, is hard during this time because of the droughts, and so that led to malnutrition. There's a scarcity of food, so people are malnourished, and of course pneumonia. People are breathing the particles of dust, and that is going to develop, of course, infections in the respiratory system, in the lungs, leading to viruses of all kinds, of course, and pneumonia, of course. So this is very unfortunate, again, that people are feeling now, of course, the effects of the depression coming from nature herself, on top of, again, of the decisions that human beings, again, made regarding how the economy was based and run, etc., and consumption, etc. So besides that, there's nature participating in history, making the depression a real phenomenon, in other words. And also, again, that during the 1930s, there were plagues, there were certain insects, for example, that became extremely active. The locust, they're called the locust, is a kind of grasshopper. It's a kind of grasshopper that multiplies by the millions very quickly and becomes active in certain periods, certain cycles of nature. Is not present in active, in every year. It actually hides in the ground, in certain periods of time, and then in others, it becomes highly active, in other words. And those devour entire fields of food, whether it's corn or wheat, etc., rather quickly, devastates entire fields in a matter of days. They destroy them. They eat all of the food that people, of course, are growing, all the food. And of course, that affected particular areas of the world, like Latin America, again, was affected heavily by the locust, and the African continent was also affected by the locust. So even in the situation where farmers were able to grow some food because they had access to water, like rivers, diverting water out of the river, etc., they also face, of course, the grasshopper, the locust, as they were called, in that just at the time of harvest or in mid-cycle, the locusts will come along, of course, and devour our entire fields, of course. So again, this is, the situation now that moves the United States into now the Great Depression is a real, of course, phenomenon that affecting millions of lives. People are unemployed, evicted from their homes, unable to pay back loans, and even put food on the table, just because of the scarcity, again, of food around the world, of course. And again, there's going to be, of course, certain responses, that the federal government, particularly two presidential administrations, are going to enact. How they're going to actually respond to the Great Depression, well, this is something that we're going to see in session 3. The federal government is going to respond to the Great Depression in very different ways. Again, looking at that two different political administrations. This is something that we're going to assess in depth in session 3, looking at the rise, for example, of FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, of course, and dealing with the Great Depression by introducing new reforms, economic reforms to reform the American economy. And all of the reforms that FDR proposed were called the New Deal. The New Deal legislation to reform the capitalist system, to provide relief to the population, to provide assistance, jobs, etc. All of that will be totally assessed in session 3, and also the outcomes, what the Great Depression also accomplished. This is the end of session 2, and we're going to actually, again, cover the remaining portions of the Great Depression in session 3 when we come back. Thank you.